Hello, good morning. Edgardo Sambu here once more. And this time we are now on episode number 31. And the title for today would be The Third Heaven. Third Heaven. How many heavens are there? Some religions would teach you that there are seven heavens. Some religions would teach you that there are three heavens, and some would teach you that there is only one heaven. And there is a religion that declared that heaven and hell do not exist. This religion had declared when they published an article last August 16, 1999 in a certain newspaper that heaven and hell do not exist, that they only exist in the minds of people. Is there really a heaven or heavens? Now, which one is correct? To authenticate this, we have to resort to the Bible for clarifications. In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, under the King James Version, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. You would notice that the word used was the word heaven, which is in singular form. Now, in other Bible translations, in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse 1, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You would notice that the word used was the word heavens, which is in the plural form. Now, which version is correct? Is it the King James Version of the Bible or the other versions of the Bible? Let us try to analyze both premises. Let us use first the King James Version of the Bible. In the book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 2 to 4, it states, I knew a man in Christ about 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such a one caught up to the third heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body, I cannot tell, God knoweth. How that he was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words, which it is not lawful for a man to utter. There it is. There is a third heaven, and if there is a third heaven, naturally there is a second heaven, and naturally there is also a first heaven. Paradise is within the third heaven. Since the third heaven is the highest of all heavens, then the second heaven is below the third heaven, and the first heaven is below the second heaven, and below the first heaven is earth. It is very clear then that the Bible had stated that there is a third heaven. Naturally, if there is a third heaven, there is a second heaven and a first heaven. So from this verse, it is proven that there are three heavens: the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven. It is stated in Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 that God created the heaven and the earth. Take note that the universe is approximately 15 billion years old and the earth is approximately 5 billion years old. It means that the earth was created after 10 billion years upon the creation of the universe. This is according to science. And please read my track entitled The Creation. The heaven and the earth were not created at the same time. When God said that He created the heaven and the earth, which heaven was that? We had proven that there are three heavens. In that verse, God had created the third heaven. At that point in time, the second heaven and the first heaven were not yet in existence. Now the question is, where is the first heaven located? In the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 6 to 8, it states, "And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day." When God created the earth, there was a big body of water called the ocean. As you would notice, God created the light in Genesis chapter 1 verse 3, which states, "And God said, Let there be light, and there was light." This light had caused some of the waters of the ocean to evaporate into the clouds and started to condense to form rain. The first waters mentioned was the ocean, and the second waters mentioned was the rain in the clouds. And in between these two waters was a firmament or distance or space, which God called as heaven. This is now the first heaven, the space between the ocean and the rain in the clouds. It is very clear then that the first heaven is actually above the earth, right here on the land. That's where the first heaven started. And the end of the first heaven ended above the clouds where the rain is. But before I discuss the second heaven, first let us go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 as used in other Bible versions, which states, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." If it is confirmed that God had created the three heavens at the same time, then this verse would be wrong. It appears that God had created the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven at the same time. That will not be possible, since when He created the first heaven, together with the two other heavens, earth was not yet in existence. and we had proven that the first heaven is on earth. Then this version of some other Bible translations will not be in conformity with the creation. It is then that the King James Version of the Bible is the correct version when it comes to this verse, in which, in the King James Version, it had stated, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." The word heaven is in the singular form. Now the question is, where is the second heaven located? Naturally, the first heaven is the lowest of the three heavens, and the third heaven is the highest. Therefore, the second heaven will be the space between the first heaven and the third heaven. The second heaven will start right after where the first heaven had ended. I will now be discussing the second heaven. In the book of Ephesians, chapter 2, verses 1 to 2, it states, "And you hath he quickened, who were dead in trespasses and sins, wherein in time past you walk according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience." It mentioned prince of the power of the air. This prince referred to Satan. And the second heaven started right after the first heaven had ended, right after the clouds. And the second heaven ended right after the third heaven had started. When Satan and his cohorts failed to find favors from God in the third heaven, they were ordered to leave the third heaven, and they were forced to occupy the second heaven. In the verse, you would notice that it says, "according to the prince of the power of the air." These powers of the air are Satan and his cohorts, and their residence is the second heaven. In the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 12, it states, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." It says, spiritual wickedness in high places. This spiritual wickedness refers to Satan and his cohorts, and high places refers to the second heaven. It is very clear then that Satan and his cohorts are occupying the second heaven, since they were thrown out of the third heaven eon of years ago. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 12, verses 26 to 28, it states, "Whose voice then shook the earth, but now he hath promised, saying, Yet once more I shake not the earth only, but also heaven. And this word, yet once more, signifieth the removing of those things that are shaken, as of things that are made, which cannot be moved. Let us have grace, whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. The words which say, a kingdom which cannot be moved, refer to the new heaven and the new earth, which God will create for humans to dwell after the last judgment. A time will come when God will shake the earth and the third heavens, and these three heavens and the earth will disappear. This old earth and the third heaven will be replaced by a new heaven and a new earth, as mentioned in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 1. It is this new heaven that the righteous will inherit, not the old third heaven, since the third heaven had already disappeared. The reason why God will create the new heaven is because the old heaven was tainted with blemish and stain because of the wrongdoing of Satan and his cohorts eons of years ago. This cannot be, since the new heaven is supposed to be perfect without blemish or stain. Of course, this appearance of the new heaven will transpire after the last judgment. In the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 29, it states, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. The heavens being mentioned here are the first heaven and the second heaven and the third heaven, in which the third heaven will also be shaken. But as what the Bible said, the third heaven will be replaced by a new heaven. In the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 35, it states, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. The first heaven, second heaven, and the earth, and the third heaven will pass away, and this will happen after the last judgment, to be replaced by a new heaven and a new earth without blemish or stain. In the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verse 1, it states, And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. The first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven, and the first earth had passed away. In the book of Revelation, chapter 20, verse 11, it states, And I saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. The first heaven and the earth, and the second heaven and the third heaven had vanished. In summary, there are three heavens: the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven. The first heaven is within the earth's atmosphere. The second heaven is where Satan and his cohorts reside. And the third heaven is where God the Father is. A time will come when the first heaven and the old earth, the second heaven and the third heaven will vanish. After the disappearance of the third heaven, God will make a new heaven and a new earth, in which, in this new heaven, will reside those humans who had been raptured, and those humans and angels who had passed the last judgment. It is very clear then, according to the Bible, that there are 3 heavens, not 7 heavens, or no heavens at all. There are 3 heavens. The first heaven is right here on top of the earth, on top of the ocean, in which this first heaven will end on the clouds where the rain is. And the second heaven will start right after the clouds where the rain is, and will end right after where the third heaven will start. And this second heaven is the heaven where Satan and his cohorts were thrown out after they were thrown out from the third heaven. Because Satan and his cohort eons of years ago had rebelled against God. And because of this, God had thrown Satan and his cohorts to the second heaven. And the third heaven will start right after where the second heaven had ended. And this third heaven is where God the Father had been residing all this time. And you could find paradise on this third heaven. So we have the first heaven right on top of the earth. We have the second heaven where Satan and his cohorts had been residing. And we had the third heaven where God the Father had been residing. But please take note, after the last judgment, this first heaven and the earth, and the second heaven, and the third heaven will be destroyed, or will vanish, or will disappear. There will be no more heavens, no more first heaven, no more second heaven, no more third heaven. And these heavens and the earth will be replaced by God the Father with a new earth and with a new heaven. And human beings who would pass the test of salvation, that is passing the last judgment, will be inhabiting the new heaven and the new earth, because the first heaven, the second heaven, and the third heaven had already disappeared. Excuse me. So churches or denominations who will teach you that there are 7 heavens, do not believe it, because 7 heavens could not be found in the Bible. And churches who would teach you that there is no heaven and no hell are lying, because no such verses that says there is no heaven and no hell could not be found in the Bible. These leaders of churches are fooling you. In fact, one of the biggest Christian churches had declared a long time ago, that was August 16, 1999, and it was published in a certain newspaper, that there is no such thing as hell or heaven, that this hell or heaven only existed in the minds of human beings. And some will tell you that there's only one heaven. Do not believe this, because there's no such verse in the Bible that had stated that there's only one heaven. In fact, Genesis 1 Genesis chapter 1 verse 1, it had stated that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. That heaven was the third heaven. That was the first heaven that God had created. After God had created the earth, that was the time when God created the first heaven. And the second heaven was created when God had thrown Satan and his cohorts away from the third heaven. That was the time when God created the second heaven, so that this second heaven will be the place where Satan and his cohorts will reside. It is very clear then that we have the first heaven, the second heaven, the third heaven, not seven heavens, not one heaven, not no heavens, or no hell. These are non-biblical doctrines which have been formulated by humans who do not understand what were written in the Bible. So my dear fellow Christians, my fellow Bible-believing Christians, I hope you had understood this video. When you go to a certain church and they had taught you a different kind of heavens, do not believe it. Always be biblical when you are trying to believe a certain doctrine that was written in the Bible. For those who would like to view my other broadcasts, just go to YouTube and go to the word search and type my name, Edgardo Sambo, and YouTube will present to you all those videos from episode 1 to episode number 31. And if you would like to subscribe, just ring the notification bell so that all videos will be given to you by YouTube for viewing. In the meantime, I would invite you after 2 weeks to view another video that I am going to broadcast. And in the meantime, I would say bye-bye and may God bless us all. Thank you very much.